Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we retake a journey into the past, not the glamorous palaces or the heroic battles you've seen in movies, but the raw, gritty, and unforgettable reality of life in history. If you love history told in a way that's vivid, immersive, and yes, a little bit boring in the most relaxing sense, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy exploring history from a perspective you've never considered, and subscribe to the channel for more journeys like this, while rebuilding a community of curious minds who want to see the world as it truly was, and maybe learn a lesson or two along the way. Also, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide history can reach. Tonight, we're stepping into Victorian London, a city of ambition, innovation, and astonishing contrasts. On the surface, it may look like the London of top hats, horse-drawn carriages, and misty gas lamps, but don't be fooled. The reality was far more complicated. Imagine a city where fog clings to your skin. Streets are choked with smoke and filth, and the air carries a mixture of industry, sewage, and life itself struggling to survive. This wasn't a place for comfort. It was a place for endurance. As we begin, picture opening your eyes in a small, cramped room. The floorboards creak beneath your feet. Dust drifts in from the cracked window, and the smell of yesterday's coal fire still lingers. Your home is barely more than a shelter, yet it's the world you know, and somehow it feels familiar. Each day starts with a small, quiet struggle. Finding food, navigating dangerous streets, and avoiding the ever-present hazards of city life. Every step outside is a test of balance, wit, and stamina. The streets themselves are alive, sometimes literally. Hooves of horses clatter against uneven cobblestones. Carts careen around corners. In the relentless energy of a city that never truly sleeps, presses in from every direction. You've got to watch your step, mind the gutters, and be ready for the unexpected. Life here doesn't wait for anyone, and neither does the city. But don't worry, we won't just dwell on hardship. Alongside the struggle, there's resilience, creativity, and moments of quiet humanity that shine even in the darkest corners. People find ways to survive, laugh, and even celebrate amidst the chaos. And that's exactly what we're going to explore tonight. The lives of ordinary people. Their struggles, their ingenuity, and the small triumphs that kept them moving forward, day after day. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe even grab a cup of tea, and let yourself be transported. By the end of this journey, you'll see Victorian London, not as a dusty relic in a history book, but as a living, breathing world full of challenges, resilience, and stories worth remembering. Now, let's step outside together and begin walking the foggy, bustling streets of Victorian London. As you step further into the streets of Victorian London, the city's true character begins to unfold, far removed from the neatly manicured gardens, elegant ballrooms, and top-hatted gentlemen that so often grace the pages of novels or the silver screen. Here, the air is thick with smoke and fog, the kind that clings stubbornly to your skin and hair, seeping into every fold of clothing, every crevice of your lungs, and even into the very essence of the buildings themselves. Leaving behind a persistent reminder that in this city, life is lived in shades of gray rather than gold. The streets are alive in a way that can be both mesmerizing and terrifying. Horse-drawn carts thunder past with reckless speed, their wheels splashing through ankle-deep sludge that smells faintly of rot, refuse, and the mingled exhalations of hundreds of thousands of residents trying desperately to survive, while hawkers, newsboys, vendors shout endlessly over one another, each voice competing for attention in a cacophony that is as much part of the city's rhythm as the church bells that mark the hours. Sidewalks, if they can be called that, are narrow, cracked, and often submerged under mud or sewage, leaving pedestrians to negotiate a treacherous dance of agility and awareness. where a single misstep can send you sprawling into the muck or under the hooves of a passing horse. And yet, everyone moves with a practiced grace, accustomed to the unpredictability and chaos of their environment. Life in Victorian London is a test of endurance in ways that modern imagination struggles to comprehend. The working class, which constitutes the majority of the city's population, wakes each morning to the relentless grind of survival, often in living spaces so small and so poorly ventilated that the distinction between home and work seems to vanish entirely, where a single shared room may house entire families with a thin mattress on a wooden plank serving as the bed, a chamber pot tucked into the corner for necessity, and the ever-present smell of smoke, sweat, and unwashed bodies saturating the air. Breakfast, if it can even be called that, is rarely more than a hasty consumption of leftover bread, a thin porridge, or perhaps nothing at all, depending on what scraps can be found or earned through menial labor. And from there, the day stretches endlessly, filled with peril and opportunity in equal measure. Young children toil alongside adults in factories, docks, and workshops, their small hands performing tasks too dangerous or delicate for larger limbs, while women, their skin calloused and raw from hours of scrubbing laundry, washing floors, or sewing garments, navigate the same streets, burdened by both the physical demands of labor and the social pressures of a world that offers them few choices beyond endurance, resilience, and ingenuity. Yet, even amidst the suffocating grime and the unyielding demands of daily life, there exists a quiet humanity that persists in the shadows, neighbors who share the warmth of a small fire, chimney sweeps who guide new apprentices through narrow shafts with patience and care, and small acts of kindness that, though seemingly insignificant, provide threads of hope woven into the harsh tapestry of survival. Pubs, too, become sanctuaries of sorts, overcrowded and loud, their air heavy with smoke and the scent of ale, yet within their walls, laughter, music, fleeting moments of reprieve remind everyone that life, even at its most brutal, still holds room for connection, celebration, and the persistence of spirit. In Victorian London, to live is to endure, to observe, to adapt, and to find humanity in the smallest of gestures. For it is precisely these small victories, these quiet rebellions against the relentless city, that define existence in a world where comfort is rare, danger is constant, and survival is above all else. It's an act of resilience and courage. As the morning fog lifts just enough to reveal the labyrinth of streets and alleyways that crisscross Victorian London, the reality of daily life begins to press down on every sense with a weight that is at once exhausting and inescapable. For to exist here is to live in a city that refuses to forgive, where the air itself carries the stories of countless struggles, the acrid tang of coal smoke lingering stubbornly, clinging to hair, skin, clothing, as if intent on marking each resident with the evidence of their endurance, while the pungent stench of open drains, refuse, and uncollected waste winds through the narrow streets in invisible tendrils, mingling with the sweat and toil of men, women, and children whose lives are bound inextricably to the rhythms of survival. Every step outside is an exercise in vigilance, a constant negotiation between moving forward and avoiding the hazards that present themselves at every turn. Horse-drawn carts careen through the streets with little regard for pedestrians, splashing filth and debris with each turn of their wheels. Vendors call out in urgent, hoarse voices, their shouts blending into a relentless symphony of commerce, while the cries of children, both work-bound and orphaned, pierce the air, a haunting reminder that even youth here is entwined with labor and necessity rather than carefree play. In this world, survival is not merely a matter of obtaining food or shelter, though those are arduous tasks in themselves, but of navigating an environment designed as much by neglect as by the ambitions of industry and empire, where the line between life and misfortune can be as thin as a slippery cobblestone. and where disease, injury, exhaustion are as constant and inevitable as the tolling of the church bells that mark the hours, reminding all who listen that time passes regardless of circumstance, indifferent to hardship or suffering. Families, often packed into a single, dimly lit room that reeked of unwashed bodies and lingering smoke, rise each day to the same challenges: the collection of water from contaminated sources, the preparation of meals that barely sustain, the threading of labor into every available moment, and the endless confrontation with the city itself, which seems to conspire against those who lack privilege, favoring instead the strong, the fast, and the fortunate. Even the act of breathing requires negotiation. The smoke from countless fireplaces and factories seeps into every corner, leaving lungs coated with soot, eyes stinging, throats raw. Yet the people move onward with a rhythm born of necessity, their bodies and minds adapting to an environment that refuses to yield comfort or certainty. Amid this daily grind, one begins to recognize a strange kind of resilience emerging from the filth, smoke, and stench, an ability to find small joys in fleeting moments, to laugh at absurdity, to trade stories in alleyways and pubs, to help a neighbor lift a fallen cart or guide a frightened child through a maze of hazards, and to endure not only because one must, but because there is an almost defiant pride in surviving, in existing fully and stubbornly in a world that seeks at every turn to challenge the body, test the mind, and erode the spirit. It is a testament to human endurance that, despite the overwhelming density of misery and risk, the city thrums with life, with tenacity, with quiet victories that may go unnoticed by history, yet define the lived experience of Victorian London in all its chaotic, intoxicating, and indelible reality. Amid the thick, choking fog and the relentless hum of Victorian London, life for the working class residents unfolded as a relentless gauntlet of dangers and deprivations, each day stretching into the next with a rhythm dictated less by choice than by the merciless demands of survival. For every street carried its own hazards, and every occupation its own quiet horrors. The streets themselves, far from being mere pathways, functioned as chaotic arenas where the strongest instincts and quickest reflexes were the difference between minor inconvenience and serious injury. As horse-drawn carts barreled around corners without warning, their iron wheels splashing mud, waste, and detritus into the faces and clothing of pedestrians who had learned, through bitter experience, to read the subtle cues of the city: the slight wobble of a cart, the raised hoof of a horse, the faint shuffle of a vendor's stall that signaled imminent danger. Even crossing the street was an exercise in strategy and luck, a calculated negotiation with fate, as the sidewalks, when present, were narrow and uneven, and the gutters carried not only stagnant water, but rotting organic matter and discarded refuse. Each step a potential hazard in a landscape where cleanliness was a luxury few could afford and safety a fleeting illusion. For those laboring in the factories, docks, and workshops that powered London's growing industrial empire, the risks extended beyond the streets and into the very spaces where livelihoods were earned. Machinery clanged and hissed, belts whirred with a mechanical precision that ignored the fragile human bodies in its vicinity, and the careless oversight of managers often meant that an accident, losing a finger, a hand, or worse, was met not with compensation, but with cold indifference and the reminder that another child or adult was waiting to take the navigant position, eager enough to endure the same hardships for the slightest chance of wage. Cold, dust-coated lungs, textile fibers, frayed skin, fatigued, and the chemical byproducts of industry lingered invisibly in the air, exacting their toll in coughs, fevers, and long-term ailments that doctors could neither fully understand nor effectively treat, leaving families in perpetual uncertainty about the health and longevity of their loved ones. Women's labor was equally grueling, bound by expectations of domestic service, laundry, needlework, or factory employment that demanded hours upon hours of repetitive, exhausting motion, often for wages so low that even the simplest meals remained a rare indulgence rather than a routine certainty. And yet, their work was essential, forming the backbone of household and industrial productivity alike. Though seldom recognized or rewarded with anything beyond exhaustion and societal expectation. Children, meanwhile, navigated the intersection of survival and exploitation, their small frames tasked with roles deemed too delicate or too hazardous for adults, threading machines, hauling coal, cleaning chimneys, carrying messages through bustling streets where the slightest misstep could mean injury, illness, or death, and even the act of play was tempered by the demands of contribution to family income, as every coin earned could determine whether the household would eat, endure another day, or be plunged into deprivation. Illnesses ran rampant, fueled by overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the unrelenting smog that blanketed the city, while medical care remained primitive, often experimental and expensive, making recovery an uncertain prospect. And yet, despite the constant threat of injury, sickness, and poverty, the working-class Londoners persisted, moving with a rhythm of resilience and quiet courage, negotiating the dangers of each day with a mixture of experience, instinct, and necessity, proving that survival in such a city required not only physical endurance, but a mental fortitude as relentless as the city itself, a capacity to confront the world's harshness while still carving out spaces of connection, small joy, and fleeting reprieve wherever possible. Amid the relentless rhythm of Victorian London, the lives of women unfolded in a way that blended endurance, skill, and quiet defiance, for each day demanded a seemingly impossible combination of labor, vigilance, and unyielding fortitude, beginning often before dawn when the city was still draped in the thick fog, and the soft clatter of waking streets barely suggested the chaos to come. Domestic service, which employed countless women from across the working class, required them to rise early to stoke fires, prepare meals, polish floors until they gleamed despite the soot and grime that never truly left the walls, and attend to the needs of families whose comfort depended entirely on the tireless labor of those who lived on the margins, moving from room to room, task to task, with precision and care, their own fatigue and discomfort considered irrelevant in comparison to the expectations of their employers. And yet, the work was as isolating as it was exhaustive, with little opportunity for rest or reprieve, and even less compensation than one might imagine sufficient to sustain a body already taxed by endless hours of bending, scrubbing, carrying, and cleaning. Those who labored in laundry rooms or industrial workshops fared no better, for the hours were long, often extending from the first pale light of morning until the lamps flickered dimly in the evening. And the conditions were grueling in ways that modern imaginations struggle to comprehend. Steam and boiling water filled cramped spaces where the air itself seemed thick with moisture and the smell of wet linen. Hands and arms raw from scrubbing and wringing, backs aching from repetitive motion, while the constant pressure to meet quotas or satisfy the relentless demand of production left no room for error or delay. And a single misstep could mean scolding, lost wages, or worse, injury. Sewing, embroidery, and other textile work, though often considered genteel forms of labor in comparison to the brutal environment of a factory floor, carried its own hidden burdens, for it demanded meticulous attention to detail, the unflinching patience to repeat the same motion for hours on end, and eyes strained from dim lighting that cast shadows across threads and patterns, leaving hands blistered and eyesight weakened over time, all for wages that could barely secure bread and water, let alone comfort or security. Even industrial labor, where women worked alongside men in textile mills, match factories, or coal processing, presented dangers that were immediate and unrelenting. The roar of machinery, the constant threat of fire or chemical exposure, and the absence of any safety regulations meant that every day could deliver injury, illness, or death in ways both sudden and invisible. As lungs filled with dust, skin burned from chemicals, or teeth and hair suffered under the relentless assault of factory conditions. Yet women persisted, adapting, enduring, and finding a rhythm within the chaos. Their strength as much mental and emotional as it was physical. For to labor in Victorian London was not simply to earn wages, but to assert existence in a world that often sought to render them invisible. And yet, amid the exhaustion and deprivation, moments of subtle triumph and human connection punctuated their lives. Sharing a whispered joke with a fellow worker during a brief pause, trading scraps of food or comfort, teaching a younger sister or daughter the skills that might ensure survival, or finding fleeting beauty in a sunset glimpsed from a factory window. These small acts became the threads that held their worlds together, weaving resilience, solidarity, and quiet rebellion into the fabric of their daily existence, proving that even in the harshest of environments, women in Victorian London were not merely survivors, they were the silent architects of endurance, the steady hands that kept families, communities, and entire industries moving forward, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. Among the throngs of laborers, children were perhaps the most vulnerable, yet paradoxically, they were also indispensable to the daily functioning of Victorian London's relentless industrial engine. For from an age that would today be considered impossibly young, their small hands, quick reflexes, and nimble bodies were put to work in conditions that would test the limits of even the strongest adult, navigating spaces filled with hazards, both visible and unseen, and in doing so, they became, almost unwillingly, apprentices in survival, resilience, and the harsh realities of life. In factories, the worry machinery roared with mechanical ferocity, belts and cogs spinning without pause, while children darted between the moving parts, feeding looms, tending furnaces, or carrying heavy loads across slippery, sooty floors, where a single misstep could result in a crushed limb, a severe burn, or worse. Yet the work had to be done, for the wages earned by a child, meager though they were, often constituted the difference between a family eating or going hungry, and the pressures of economic necessity were relentless, leaving little room for fear, hesitation, or complaint. At the docks, the situation was equally perilous. Children were tasked with hauling crates, loading and unloading ships, and navigating muddy quays lined with rotting timber and slick stones, their small frames darting through the chaotic ballet of dockhands, horses, and wagons, where one misjudged step could see them thrown into icy water or crushed under the weight of a falling cargo. Exposure to the elements compounded their hardships, as rain, cold, and wind gnawed at their bodies day after day, while the pervasive stench of fish, refuse, and stagnant water filled their nostrils, leaving no corner of their existence untouched by the relentless assault of environment and circumstance. Even inside the factories, the dangers multiplied. Match factories, for example, exposed children to white phosphorus, a chemical so toxic that prolonged contact could literally eat away at the jaw, leaving horrific disfigurement and intense pain, while the dust, soot, and chemical fumes circulated endlessly through poorly ventilated rooms, making coughs, fevers, and long-term respiratory issues an almost inevitable part of daily life. Yet, despite the physical risks and ever-present threat of illness, children found ways to endure, to adapt, and even to find moments of fleeting reprieve, forming bonds with peers, exchanging whispered stories, and discovering humor and ingenuity in the smallest corners of their world. Whether it was devising a clever shortcut through a factory floor, sharing a meager snack, or simply finding a quiet moment to imagine a life beyond the smog, the grime, and the ceaseless clamor of labor. These young lives, though fragile in the eyes of history, were imbued with a resilience born of necessity, a quiet courage that allowed them to navigate daily perils with astonishing tenacity, learning early that survival was a skill honed not only by physical strength, but by awareness, cleverness, and the unspoken understanding that every day endured was a small triumph over circumstances stacked overwhelmingly against them, and that within their struggle lay a testament to the indomitable human spirit, resilient even in the most brutal and unrelenting urban landscapes of Victorian London. As the sun arcs high over Victorian London, casting light that barely penetrates the ever-present haze, the harshness of survival is compounded not only by grueling labor and treacherous streets, but by the precarious state of health and medicine. For the medical knowledge of the era was still in its infancy, and the care available to the working class was often rudimentary at best and dangerously experimental at worst, leaving countless families to navigate sickness, injury, and infection with little more than hope, home remedies, or the occasional intervention of an overworked physician who may have had good intentions but limited tools and understanding. Disease spreads with merciless efficiency in overcrowded tenements, where the stench of refuse, stagnant water, and smoke provides a constant reminder that germs and contagion are invisible companions of daily life, and yet unavoidable as children cough and wheeze through narrow halls. Women labor through fevers while trying to maintain households, and men who survive injuries on the street or in factories must still return to work because there is no safety net, no paid leave, no respite from the demands of existence. Small illnesses that might be minor to day coughs, fevers, infected cuts could escalate into life-threatening conditions in a matter of days. And a single misfortune could unravel an entire family's fragile stability. Compounding these challenges was the widespread availability of substances like alcohol and opium, sold over the counter in pharmacies or consumed as part of daily life, often as palliatives to dull pain, grief, or exhaustion, and sometimes with deadly consequences. For a mother mourning the loss of a child, for a laborer enduring relentless fatigue, or for an orphan trying to survive on the streets, these substances offered temporary relief but introduced new hazards, stunning awareness while failing to address the underlying dangers of disease, malnutrition, and overwork. Tonum, laudanum, and other potions were handed out liberally, dosages imprecise, side effects poorly understood. Minimal, meaning that in a single day, a person could find themselves teetering between temporary comfort and permanent harm, and yet, in the absence of reliable alternatives, these substances became lifelines, however imperfect, for those caught in the unyielding machinery of survival. The streets themselves mirrored this precarious balance between life and peril, for illness was not confined to bedrooms or hospitals, but floated invisibly through the air, contaminating every corner of public life. Water, food, and even the very touch of another person carried risk, while the smell of smoke, soot, and waste clung to every surface, making the environment itself a subtle accomplice in the persistence. Doctors, when accessible, were often overwhelmed, resorting to methods that ranged from the bizarre to the brutal leeches, unsterilized surgery, and experimental medicines, while antiseptic practices were still in their infancy. And many patients fared no better under professional care than they would attempting recovery alone. The city, in its relentless indifference, allowed no pause, no margin for error, and in this crucible, survival became not only a matter of strength and agility, but of careful navigation through the intertwined dangers of labor, its environment, and the very remedies meant to heal. And yet, amidst this precarious existence, Londoners demonstrated an extraordinary resourcefulness. Families devised makeshift remedies from herbs, vinegar, and boiled water. Neighbors shared knowledge, food, and comfort. And those who could afford a scrap of alcohol or opium used it with careful, practiced moderation to ease the daily burden of an existence that demanded more than mere endurance. The combination of frailty, ingenuity, and stubborn persistence defined the lived reality of Victorian London where every breath carried risk, every task held hidden dangers, and yet life, remarkably persisted, carried forward by the resilience, ingenuity, and sheer determination of its inhabitants, who refused to be vanquished by the city's relentless trials. Amid the relentless challenges, the grime, and the ever-present threats of Victorian London, life was not solely defined by suffering and hardship. Woven into the fabric of daily existence was a quiet, tenacious resilience that emerged from the most ordinary yet profoundly meaningful human interactions, a network of subtle kindness, solidarity, and shared endurance that allowed communities to survive not just physically, but emotionally, giving the people small, vital reasons to keep moving forward despite the oppressive weight of poverty and danger. In narrow alleyways and cramped tenements, neighbors looked after one another in ways that may seem inconspicuous to modern eyes, but were life-saving in context. A mother might share a meager loaf of bread with another family when their pantry ran empty. An older sibling would take younger children through treacherous streets with careful vigilance. And a chimney sweep might pause mid-climb to reassure a frightened apprentice, offering encouragement and guidance to navigate the deadly tightness of the flues, imparting wisdom that was literally a matter of life and death. These acts, often unrecorded and seemingly small, created threads of trust and safety, the invisible scaffolding of community that allowed individuals to endure what might otherwise have been unbearable. Public houses, or pubs, became another cornerstone of resilience, functioning as informal hubs where the city's laborers and families could gather after the grueling hours of work, providing not only a chance to quench thirst and share a meal, but a vital space to exchange news, stories, and humor, reinforcing a sense of connection that was as necessary to survival as food or shelter. Within these crowded, smoky rooms, strangers became companions, and laughter could rise above the clatter of mugs and the murmur of conversation, binding people together in fleeting yet deeply human ways. Men and women, children and elders alike, found in these spaces a temporary reprieve from the omnipresent grime and peril, a place where shared hardship became a source of camaraderie rather than despair, where the weight of the city could, for a moment, be lifted through song, storytelling, or the comforting familiarity of human presence. Even the smallest gestures carried profound significance, lending a scrap of clothing, offering a hand to push a cart free of muck, or simply sharing a kind word in passing. These were the moments that sustained spirits, reminding everyone that even in the most oppressive circumstances, they were not entirely alone. For many, the understanding that someone else shared their struggle, that there was someone who would notice, intervene, or simply stand beside them, was the subtle but vital force that allowed life to continue in a city that seemed designed to crush hope. Through collective endurance, laughter amidst adversity, and compassion expressed in gestures, both small and large, Londoners built a resilience that was as much social and emotional as it was physical. It's a quiet defiance against the hardships that define the streets, factories, and tenements of their world. It is within these moments, tucked between labor and illness, danger and exhaustion, that the true heartbeat of Victorian London emerges, a city of struggle, certainly, but also of enduring humanity, where the connections forged in adversity became the lifelines that allowed people to persist, care, and, in their own ways, to create meaning and joy amidst the ceaseless trials of existence, proving that even in the grimiest, smoke-filled streets, hope could be found not in grand gestures or heroic exploits, but in the shared experience of survival, in the solidarity of community, and in the small acts of kindness that illuminated the darkness one day at a time. Yet, when we step away from the mist-filled streets of London and cast our gaze much further back into the ancient world, we find another figure whose story reminds us that resilience, wisdom, and quiet strength have always played a vital role in shaping human history, even if they are often hidden beneath the towering shadows of kings and warriors. in the rugged land of Sparta, where the harsh mountains met the disciplined lives of its people. A queen emerged whose intelligence and influence set her apart, a woman whose name still echoes across centuries, Gorgo of Sparta. Unlike many women in the ancient Greek world, whose voices were frequently silenced or confined to the domestic sphere, Gorgo stood at the very heart of her city's political and social life, her sharp wit and pragmatic mind earning her respect not only within her household, but across the Spartan state itself. From an early age, Gorgo demonstrated the qualities that would one day make her an enduring figure in history. When visiting dignitaries arrived in Sparta, expecting to deal solely with the hardened warriors who defined the city's reputation, they often found themselves surprised by the clarity and decisiveness of the queen's words, her ability to cut through elaborate speeches or subtle manipulations with simple, piercing truths that left no room for misunderstanding. There are accounts that describe her offering advice to her father, King Cleomenes, and later to her husband, King Leonidas, advice that was not only heard but acted upon. For she had the rare ability to see the hidden dangers behind smooth words and tempting offers, reminding those around her that wisdom was as crucial to Sparta's survival as swords and shields. Her pragmatism was legendary, and her voice carried weight in decisions that touched the fate of her people, something extraordinary in a world where women were so rarely acknowledged in political arenas. Unlike the silken courts of Athens, where rhetoric and performance flourished, Sparta's way of life valued clarity, endurance, and discipline, and in Gorgo, these qualities were distilled into a presence that commanded both attention and trust. She understood that survival was not only a matter of military strength, but also of foresight, diplomacy, and the ability to see through deception. But Gorgo's legacy extended beyond political sharpness. She also embodied the balance of Spartan life, where women held a unique position compared to much of the Greek world. Trained in physical fitness, entrusted with managing estates when men marched to war, and expected to uphold the discipline of their society, Spartan women carried responsibilities that shaped the very backbone of their culture, and Gorgo stood at the pinnacle of this tradition. She represented the voice of reason in times of uncertainty, the quiet strategist beside the warrior king, and the enduring proof that power and wisdom were not bound by the limits of gender, but could shine wherever courage, intellect, and resolve demanded recognition. In order to truly understand why Gorgo's influence was not only accepted, but respected, one must first look at the remarkable position of women in Sparta. For, unlike so many other ancient societies where women were confined to the household, their movements restricted, and their voices seldom acknowledged, Spartan women lived under an entirely different set of expectations. Expectations that were rooted in strength, education, and an unshakable sense of identity that allowed them to walk through their city with the confidence that astonished outsiders. In Athens, for instance, women were often cloistered away, denied formal schooling, and expected to remain silent in public affairs. Yet in Sparta, the very survival of the state demanded that its women be more than mere spectators of life. They were instead participants in its endurance, guardians of its culture, and in many ways, the silent pillars upon which its society stood. From their earliest years, Spartan girls were taught to cultivate both body and mind, engaging in physical training that ensured health, resilience, and the ability to bear strong children, for strength was a communal duty in a city perpetually prepared for war. And education was not denied to them, but woven into their upbringing, granting them literacy, critical thought, and the ability to converse with the same sharp directness as their male counterparts. They were taught to speak with clarity, to defend their views, and to manage the estates and affairs of their households when husbands, fathers, and sons marched away to battle. And thus, while the shields of Sparta clashed upon foreign fields, the discipline of the city continued at home, upheld in no small part by women whose authority was both recognized and expected. Foreign visitors marveled at this, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with shock, for they encountered women who did not shy from voicing their opinions, who could challenge a man with words as directly as another might challenge him with a spear, and whose very bearing conveyed an independence that felt alien to the more restrictive customs of other Greek city-states. This assertiveness was not rebellion, but rather an integral part of Spartan life. For in a culture that demanded absolute dedication to the state, the contributions of women were too essential to be diminished, and their strength too vital to be hidden. Gorgo, as queen, embodied these values in their fullest form, not only living within this tradition, but elevating it, showing that a Spartan woman could move seamlessly between household duties, political discourse, and the role of trusted advisor, proving that her intellect and assertiveness were not exceptions to the rule, but the highest expression of it. In her, the world could see the culmination of a society dared to imagine women not as silent shadows, but as visible forces in the shaping of their people's destiny, a vision that stood in stark contrast to much of the ancient world and continues to intrigue us even now. Centuries after her voice first rang clear in the halls of Sparta, and if Gorgo's presence was remarkable during the years when her husband Leonidas still stood at the head of Sparta, it became even more striking in the shadow that followed his sacrifice at Thermopylae. For though the battlefield claimed the life of one of the most celebrated kings in history, it did not silence the steady and enduring influence of the queen who had walked beside him. In the days when grief might have crushed another, Gorgo stood unbowed, carrying forward both the memory of her husband and the responsibility of guiding their son, Pleistarchus, into the role he was destined to inherit. It is said that she was not merely a passive guardian of his throne, but an active shaper of his upbringing, instilling in him the values that defined Spartan life discipline, resilience, loyalty to the state, and above all, the ability to see beyond the moment, to recognize that every decision carried consequences that stretched far into the future. In a society where boys were famously taken from their homes at the age of 7 to enter the rigorous Agoge training system, Gorgo's role might have seemed diminished once her son was handed to the state. Yet her influence never truly faded, for even in Sparta, where the city's needs were placed above all else, the shaping of a king demanded more than physical training, required the steady hand of wisdom, and Gorgo's counsel was never far away. She had witnessed firsthand the dangers of political intrigue, the fragile balance between alliances, and the unyielding demands of leadership, and she carried those lessons into the guidance she gave her son, ensuring that while the state taught him how to command soldiers, she taught him how to rule wisely. Her life after Thermopylae became a testament to endurance, not only as a widow who bore the loss of a husband, revered as a martyr of Greek freedom, but as a woman who refused to allow that loss to define her solely in sorrow. Instead, she lived as a symbol of Spartan resilience, her very presence reminding her people that sacrifice was not an end, but a seed from which future strength would grow. Foreign envoys still recorded her sharp words, her ability to cut through deception and hold her ground in a world that rarely expected women to do so. And thus, even when the glory of Thermopylae passed into legend, Gorgo herself remained a living part of Sparta's story, shaping not only her son's reign, but the perception of Spartan womanhood for generations to come. To look at Gorgo in this later stage of her life is to see the continuation of the very ideals that had defined her from the beginning: clarity of mind, steadfastness of spirit, and a quiet authority that never needed to shout to be heard. She was not only the widow of a king, nor only the mother of another, but a figure whose wisdom bridged generations, ensuring that even in the wake of terrible loss, the city of Sparta did not falter, because its queen understood that strength was not merely a matter of swords and shields, but of guidance, memory, and the resolve to endure when others might have broken. And perhaps nothing captures the essence of Gorgo's spirit more clearly than the words that echoed down through the centuries. Words attributed to her that reveal not only her wit, but also the proud, unapologetic confidence of Spartan womanhood. When asked why Spartan women seemed to command such respect and bared themselves with such boldness in contrast to the women of other lands, she is said to have answered, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." At first glance, it may strike the ear as sharp or even defiant, but within the cadence of that statement lies a powerful declaration of identity, one that captures both the singularity of Sparta and the unique place its women held within it. Unlike elsewhere in the ancient world, where women were often relegated to the background of history, Spartan women were woven into the very fabric of their society, not as silent figures, but as participants, guardians, and shapers of the future. Gorgo's words, then, are not simply a boast, but a window into how Spartan women understood themselves as the makers of warriors. Yes, but also as the preservers of a city whose survival depended on the strength of its people. In those few words is the recognition that the cycle of Spartan endurance began not in the training grounds of the Agoge, nor in the clash of shield and spear, but in the households where women raised their sons to be unyielding, where they steeled their daughters to be proud, where they themselves bore the burden of resilience, so that their city could remain unbroken. It was a statement that, like much of what Gorgo left behind, blends sharp pragmatism with a kind of poetic weight, reminding her contemporaries that power does not always come from the battlefield, nor does legacy always rest in the hands of men. The very act of giving birth and raising children became, in Sparta, an extension of civic duty and an embodiment of strength. And Gorgo's words served as a rallying cry that turned what might have been dismissed as domestic into something vital, something that lay at the heart of Spartan endurance. When we imagine her speaking those words, we see not only a queen responding with quick wit, but a woman who understood, perhaps better than anyone, the paradox of Spartan life that the city's famed warriors could not stand at Thermopylae or march into history without the unseen labor of the women who raised them, and that behind every tale of male valor was the steadfast presence of women who had given their city not only their sons, but their unwavering spirit. In this way, Gorgo's statement becomes more than a line preserved in history. It becomes her banner, her legacy, and a reminder that the story of Sparta, like the story of humanity itself, was never the tale of men alone, but of the women who shaped them, challenged them, and gave them to the world. Gorgo's legacy did not rest solely in her sharp words or the symbolic power of her position. It was also etched into the ways she thought, acted, and maneuvered within a world dominated by constant conflict and political tension. She was not a queen who simply stood beside her husband as a silent figurehead, nor did she fade into obscurity after his death. Instead, she revealed time and again that she possessed a rare combination of foresight, resilience, and an uncanny ability to interpret the ever-shifting tides of Spartan life, where survival depended not only on the clash of spears against enemy shields, but also on the delicate art of diplomacy, alliances, and an understanding of when to act with caution and when to act with defiance. Stories of Gorgo highlight her ability to grasp the broader political landscape in ways that were unusual for women of her time, and even for many men who held positions of power. From her youth, she was said to have advised her father, King Cleomenes, with a clarity and wisdom far beyond her years, and this early display of judgment foreshadowed the role she would later play as queen beside Leonidas. When faced with complex issues of foreign intrigue or the delicate balancing of Sparta's place among other Greek states, Gorgo demonstrated an instinct for recognizing both danger and opportunity. She could see through the polished words of foreign envoys, sense the hidden motives behind seemingly generous offers, and remind those around her that the survival of Sparta depended on vigilance as much as it did on courage. Even after the death of Leonidas at Thermopylae, she did not crumble under the weight of grief or fade into quiet domesticity. Instead, she remained a steady presence in the political sphere, continuing to influence and guide, ensuring that her son, Pleistoanax, and others within Sparta's leadership did not lose sight of the values and strategies that had long held their society together. In doing so, Gorgo embodied a kind of resilience that was not rooted in brute force, but in mental endurance, patience, and an unyielding commitment to Sparta's survival. Her understanding of the shifting military and political landscape reflected the reality that wars were not fought only with soldiers, but with knowledge, anticipation, and readiness for the unexpected. While men marched to battle, it was Gorgo's counsel that sometimes ensured those battles were chosen wisely, or that foreign entanglements did not entrap Sparta in ruin. Her role, though often hidden between the lines of recorded history, was crucial, for she exemplified the kind of leadership that is rarely recognized, but often proves decisive. In this light, Gorgo stands not only as the wife of Leonidas or the mother of his heirs, but as a strategist in her own right. A woman whose strength was not measured in physical combat, but in the endurance of her intellect and the clarity of her vision. Hers was a power that operated quietly yet firmly, shaping the destiny of her city from within, and ensuring that Sparta endured through one of the most turbulent chapters of its history. When we turn our attention from the rugged landscapes of Sparta to the wide, sun-scorched expanses of the Middle Eastern deserts, another story of power, vision, and artistry begins to unfold, this time under the Umayyad dynasty, the earliest rulers of the Islamic world. In those vast, open spaces where sand met sky and the horizon seemed endless, the Umayyads began to construct what became known as the desert castles. Monumental structures such as Kaza, Amshata, and Queza Amra, which rose like mirages in the wilderness. Yet these buildings were far more than simple fortresses or isolated retreats. They represented the blending of authority with sophistication, a statement of prestige and presence by rulers who wished to project their power not only through conquest, but through architecture, artistry, and the creation of spaces that could serve multiple layers of purpose all at once. These castles were not designed purely for defense, as one might expect when hearing the word castle, but instead reflected a complex vision of rulership that sought to intertwine the administrative with the aesthetic, the practical with the ceremonial. In their grand halls, rulers could receive emissaries and govern affairs with a sense of grandeur that impressed upon visitors both the strength and refinement of the Umayyad dynasty. At the same time, these desert constructions served as spaces for leisure and retreat, places where the ruling elite could step away from the bustle of urban centers like Damascus and find solace under the desert stars, surrounded by art, gardens, and water systems that demonstrated both wealth and ingenuity. Kaisar Amshata, with its elaborately carved facade, adorned with intricate geometric and floral designs, embodied a new vision of architectural beauty that fused influences from Roman, Byzantine, and Persian traditions, yet transformed them into something uniquely Islamic, setting the stage for centuries of artistic development that would follow. Meanwhile, Quasar Amra, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, dazzled with its remarkable frescoes, images of hunting scenes, musicians, and even depictions of the zodiac that revealed a vibrant and worldly court culture, one that embraced knowledge, artistry, and a cosmopolitan outlook even in the heart of the desert. By constructing these desert castles, the Umayyads were not merely erecting stone walls. They were embedding within the barren landscapes symbols of authority and cultural identity, physical manifestations of a dynasty that understood the power of beauty and the importance of leaving behind a legacy etched into the very earth. They were statements of continuity and permanence, reminders that even in the most unforgiving environments, human creativity and ambition could carve out oases of influence and splendor. What made these desert castles truly extraordinary was the way they managed to embody two worlds at once: the world of survival and pragmatism demanded by the harsh desert environment, and the world of refinement, beauty, and cultural sophistication that marked the aspirations of an empire at its height. In places where the sun blazed mercilessly and water was a precious treasure, the Umayyad architects ensured that these castles were not only visually stunning, but also ingeniously functional. They were deliberately situated near trade routes, giving rulers the ability to monitor movement and commerce, while simultaneously asserting their presence across the vast landscape. At the same time, water sources, whether from carefully engineered cisterns, aqueducts, or natural springs, were skillfully integrated into the designs, transforming the seemingly barren desert into a space where lush gardens, cooling courtyards, and refreshing baths could exist like hidden jewels. Yet, alongside this practical foresight, lay an indulgence in luxury and art that revealed how much the Umayyads valued not just power, but also the enjoyment of life's finer dimensions. Within the stone walls of these castles, visitors would find vibrant frescoes covering the interiors, scenes alive with music, hunting, feasting, and even the celestial order of the zodiac. Every brushstroke and carved detail told a story of rulers who wished to display their worldliness and their embrace of knowledge, their openness to influences that spanned cultures from the Byzantine world to Persia, and their ability to weave those inspirations into a uniquely Islamic vision of beauty. Intricate stonework adorned entrances and facades, patterns so carefully crafted that they seemed to ripple like woven fabric across the surfaces of the buildings, a testament not only to artistic brilliance, but also to the idea that architecture itself could serve as a language of authority. And while these castles contained spaces for governance and diplomacy, they were equally places of leisure and human enjoyment. Bathhouses offered warmth in winter and cool relief in summer. Courtyards were designed for gatherings under the open sky, and hunting grounds stretched beyond their walls, providing the aristocracy with both sport and sustenance. In this sense, the desert castles became more than symbols of survival or simple strongholds. They were cultural oases, worlds where the hard edge of political control softened into the pleasures of music, art, and companionship. By blending necessity with elegance, by merging function with grandeur, the Umayyads left behind creations that were as much about living well as they were about ruling effectively. Timeless reminders of how human ambition seeks to tame both the wilderness of the land and the wilderness of existence itself. What made the Umayyad desert castles even more remarkable was the way they became physical embodiments of a world in transition. Standing at the crossroads of cultures and civilizations, Kana quietly narrating the story of an empire that was never isolated, but instead deeply connected to both the East and the West. Their walls carried the visual language of Byzantine mosaics and Roman architectural traditions. Their decorative motifs drew inspiration from Persian luxury and Sasanian grandeur. And yet, they were unmistakably Islamic in spirit, weaving these influences together into something entirely new. To walk through one of these palaces in its prime would have been to witness a dialogue carved into stone and painted across plaster. A dialogue between worlds that met, clashed, and ultimately blended in ways that shaped the identity of early Islamic art and architecture. But beyond their aesthetic splendor, these castles carried a heavy symbolic weight, one that spoke of legitimacy, control, and a projection of authority across vast and often unruly lands. By erecting such monumental structures in the very heart of the desert, Umayyad rulers were not simply building comfortable retreats or administrative outposts. They were making a statement to subjects and rivals alike. The very existence of a palace with lush frescoes, flowing water, and intricate ornamentation in an unforgiving landscape announced that the rulers had the power to bend nature to their will, that they could command not only armies and trade, but also the elements themselves. This was political theater made permanent. a reminder that the caliphate's reach extended far beyond the bustling cities of Damascus or Jerusalem, into the wilderness where power had to be visible to be believed. These castles, therefore, were not passive residences, but active participants in the politics of the age. Each carefully laid stone, each imported mosaic, each carved archway reinforced the narrative of Umayyad dominance, presenting rulers as heirs to the great traditions of Rome and Persia, while also positioning them as the architects of a new cultural and spiritual order. In their blend of artistic traditions, they showcased openness and adaptability. In their sheer presence, they reinforced authority and sovereignty. Together, they became both palaces and proclamations, testaments to an empire that was carving its identity not just through conquest and governance, but through art, architecture, and the very landscapes it chose to transform. And yet, not every vision conceived within the walls of the Umayyad palaces was destined to reach completion, for the tides of politics, succession struggles, and the shifting fortunes of empires often intervened, leaving behind half-finished monuments that today stand as ghostly reminders of ambitions interrupted. These unfinished castles, though never fully realized, are themselves fascinating records of intent, capturing in stone the outlines of grand projects that once aimed to bind together the scientific curiosity, artistic ambition, and spiritual devotion of their patrons. A partially built fortress like Khazar Amshada, with its elaborate carved facade on one side and bare stone on the other, reflects both the brilliance of design and the sudden halt of circumstance, showing us how human vision could be interrupted by the uncertainties of power and history. What is remarkable about these incomplete structures is that they still reveal the depth of thought and planning invested in them, suggesting that the rulers were not merely concerned with appearances, but were deeply engaged with the intellectual and spiritual questions of their age. Their layouts often incorporated sophisticated considerations of geometry and astronomy, carefully aligning with celestial movements or natural landscapes, reminding us that early Islamic rulers were patrons of knowledge as much as wielders of authority. The placement of courtyards, water channels, and prayer halls was rarely accidental, for these elements carried symbolic weight, binding the earthly concerns of governance and leisure to the larger rhythms of faith in the cosmos. The very act of designing such a castle was as much an exercise in asserting order over the natural and spiritual world, as it was a practical endeavor to house people or conduct affairs of state. The spiritual layer of meaning in these desert castles becomes even more striking when one considers how they straddled the worlds of the sacred and the secular, balancing indulgence with reflection. A palace might have frescoes of courtly banquets or hunting scenes, yet also contain spaces deliberately oriented toward prayer and contemplation. Even in their unfinished state, one can sense that these buildings were conceived as more than residences. They were envisioned as microcosms of a world in which the temporal authority of the caliph is legitimized by alignment with divine order. The mix of luxury and devotion speaks to an understanding that power was strongest when it acknowledged both the pleasures of life and the responsibilities of faith. Thus, the incomplete desert castles serve as a testament not to failure, but to the complexity of an empire in motion, its ambitions sometimes outrunning its ability to realize them fully. They remind us that history is not only written in triumphs, but also in projects left suspended, where the intentions are just as revealing as the finished product. In their unfinished walls and silent courtyards, we glimpse the restless energy of an era that sought to marry science, spirituality, politics, and art, leaving behind not ruins of disappointment, but enduring symbols of a vision that was bold enough to stretch beyond the limits of its own time. Rising like mirages from the shifting sands, the Umayyad desert castles came to embody far more than simple outposts of rule or retreats for leisure. For they stood as bold declarations that human civilization could not only survive, but flourish, even in the most unforgiving landscapes. Their very presence, a defiance of desolation and a celebration of ingenuity. These palaces and fortresses did not merely provide shelter. They became orchestrated symphonies of stone and ornament, their intricate carvings and painted frescoes whispering stories of cultural ambition and intellectual curiosity, while their aqueducts, cisterns, carefully engineered layouts reflected a mastery of environmental adaptation that fused scientific precision with artistic expression. The walls were never silent, for they were adorned with imagery that blended the classical motifs of Byzantium, the patterns of Persian artistry, and the symbolic geometry of early Islamic vision, creating a dialogue across civilizations that gave shape to both power and beauty. In their construction, one can see not only the authority of rulers, who sought to impress their subjects and visitors with grandeur, but also the desire to integrate multiple realms of human achievement into a coherent expression of dominion and refinement. Astronomy and mathematics guided the placement of walls and domes. Water systems turned arid plains into oases of luxury, and art transformed bare interiors into halls of storytelling and wonder. Within these spaces, rulers entertained envoys, administered their domains, and prayed under ceilings painted with stars, suggesting that governance, devotion, and pleasure were never entirely separate but woven into a single fabric of life. The castles thus became living metaphors for balance, their form echoing the eternal dance between resilience and elegance, function and imagination, pragmatism and transcendence. Even centuries later, when only fragments of these structures remain, their silent stones still speak with authority, reminding us that the essence of civilization is not only found in fertile river valleys or bustling cities, but also in humanity, its ability to transform the barren and inhospitable into centers of thought, artistry, and power. They are testaments to ambition tempered by wisdom, monuments where science met symbolism, and sanctuaries where authority embraced artistry, proving that the most enduring expressions of human culture often arise precisely where survival alone would have seemed achievement enough. Long before the invention of clocks and calendars, early humans raised their eyes to the sky, finding in the steady rhythm of the heavens a language by which to order their lives. For the waxing and waning of the moon was not merely a passing spectacle, but a cosmic clock that governed everything from the time to plant seeds to the sacred rituals of worship and remembrance. Each silver crescent or glowing full disk carried meaning, guiding hunters through the darkened forests, signaling the ebb and flow of tides that determined when to fish, and weaving itself into myths that explained the cycles of birth, death, and renewal. These celestial patterns were not abstract concepts to be studied at a distance. They were the very fabric of existence, interwoven with survival and spirituality alike, reminding human communities that they were part of a greater cosmic order, one in which the rhythms of the sky echoed in the rhythms of their own hearts and daily labors. As generations passed, people began to recognize that time was not just something experienced, but something that could be tracked, anticipated, and, in a way, harnessed. The phases of the moon became a living calendar, marking festivals, migrations, and harvests, while constellations, drifting slowly across the night sky, signaled the changing seasons, telling shepherds when to move their flocks and farmers when to prepare their fields. For many cultures, these observations were infused with spiritual depth. For the celestial dance was seen as the will of the gods, and to align one's life with it was to draw closer to divine order. Around campfires and in sacred groves, elders taught the younger generations to read the stars like a sacred text, reminding them that every shift in light carried meaning, and every shadow cast upon the earth was part of a larger story written across the heavens. Thus, the earliest form of timekeeping was not mechanical, but deeply human, born out of necessity and wonder, rooted in a profound sense of connection between earth and sky. Time was not a detached measurement, but a living rhythm, carried in the cycle of the moon, at the turning of the seasons, and the eternal dance of celestial bodies, whose movements shape the destinies of entire communities. In this way, time itself became both a guide and a mystery, a bridge between the practical demands of survival and the enduring questions of existence, leading humanity step by step toward the more complex systems of measurement that would one day transform civilizations. From this intimate relationship with the heavens, the lunar cycles emerged as one of humanity's earliest and most reliable guides, their silent rhythm carving order into the uncertainty of daily life. For the glowing orb in the night sky did not simply rise and fall without consequence, but instead wove itself into the very structure of society, shaping the way fields were tilled, seeds were sown, and harvests were gathered. Farmers looked upward to the shifting face of the moon, believing that its waxing phase promised vitality and growth, while its waning signaled a time for rest, storage, or preparation for the colder seasons. And these beliefs, tested and reinforced by generations, gave rise to agricultural schedules that ensured survival in an often unpredictable world. Beyond the practical realm of farming, the moon also became the architect of humanity's first calendars, each cycle marking the passage of months long before the concept of weeks or years was standardized. And in this rhythm, people found a means of coordinating communal activities, religious festivals, and trade journeys, weaving order into the lives of scattered communities. Entire cultures tied their rituals and celebrations to lunar phases, seeing the full moon as a moment of heightened energy and spiritual closeness, while the new moon, cloaked in shadow, often marked times of reflection, renewal, or even caution. In this way, the lunar cycle was never seen as a mere astronomical curiosity, but as a living pulse of the universe, a steady reminder that human existence was intertwined with forces far greater than the self. To look upon the moon was to read the script of time itself, a script that governed crops, guided rituals, and anchored cultural traditions, binding together the cycles of nature, the rhythms of community, and the timeless search for meaning in the vast, star-strewn expanse of the night sky. As human societies grew larger and more complex, the simple observation of the moon and stars, while invaluable, no longer sufficed to organize the intricate rhythms of daily life, trade, governance, and ritual, and thus arose an urgent need for precision. For if one wished to coordinate planting across vast fields, schedule festivals, collect taxes, or plan military campaigns, a shared and reliable system of time became essential. Out of this necessity emerged the earliest attempts to divide the passage of days into manageable and predictable units, giving rise to the concept of months derived from the lunar cycles. Yet, even 12 months rarely aligned perfectly with the solar year, leaving societies to wrestle with small but accumulating discrepancies that threatened to throw planting schedules and religious observances into chaos. As centuries passed, the concept of a week emerged, a unit of time that further structured human activity, linking labor, rest, and worship into a repeating pattern that communities could universally recognize. This innovation was not merely practical, it reflected a growing awareness that time itself was both a tool and a canvas upon which civilizations could paint the order of life, aligning human effort with natural cycles, while also imposing a rhythm that brought cohesion and predictability to society. Yet, as empires expanded and the stakes of coordination increased, these early systems required even greater refinement, leading to the monumental reform of the Roman calendar under Julius Caesar in 45 BCE. The Julian calendar, which attempted to harmonize lunar observations with solar realities by standardizing months and introducing leap years, an achievement that represented not only engineering brilliance, but also the assertion of authority and control over both time and the people who lived by it. Centuries later, small miscalculations in the Julian system had accumulated to the point where seasonal markers no longer aligned with the calendar, prompting Pope Gregory XIII in 1582 to introduce the Gregorian calendar, a painstaking adjustment that corrected these drifts and established a model of precision that still governs most of the world today. Through these developments, the abstract, flowing, and often unpredictable essence of time was gradually transformed into a structured framework, allowing civilizations to thrive, coordinate, and flourish on a scale previously unimaginable, and demonstrating that humanity's ingenuity, patience, and observation could bend even the vast, impersonal forces of the cosmos into tools for survival, culture, and power. As the mastery of timekeeping evolved from simple lunar observations to the intricate systems of months, weeks, and calendars, it became increasingly clear that controlling time was not merely a matter of convenience or survival, but a profound instrument of political and religious authority. For whoever dictated the calendar effectively dictated the rhythm of life itself, deciding when crops would be sown or harvested, when communal festivals would unite or pacify populations, and when armies would march to war or retreat to safety. Leaders and priests alike recognized that the measurement of time was inseparable from power to name a day. A month or a year was to impose order on society, to encode the cycles of nature into the structures of governance, and to assert influence over both earthly and spiritual affairs. In early civilizations, the calendar became a tool to synchronize the human experience with cosmic patterns, but it also reinforced hierarchies. For the elite controlled knowledge of astronomical calculations, while the common people adhered to the schedules set by those in power, trusting in their precision and, often, fearing the consequences of misalignment with sacred dates. Festivals, marked by solstices, equinoxes, or full moons, were not only occasions for celebration or worship, but mechanisms for social cohesion. Channels through which rulers could display generosity, reinforce moral codes, and maintain the loyalty of their subjects, while also ensuring that agricultural cycles and communal labor proceeded in orderly fashion. Even warfare, often perceived as chaos incarnate, was subject to the dictates of time, for campaigns had to align with seasonal conditions, river levels, and the availability of provisions, all of which depended on careful observation and planning guided by a structured calendar. Armies marched when the earth itself permitted. Sieges were timed to exploit both nature and superstition, and victories were celebrated in harmony with celestial events, giving these military actions a sense of inevitability and divine sanction. In this way, timekeeping became far more than measurement. It became a subtle yet pervasive form of governance, a silent hand that orchestrated labor, faith, agriculture, and warfare, ensuring that societies were not merely reacting to the whims of the world around them, but moving in deliberate, regulated patterns that reflected the vision and authority of those who understood the clockwork of both heaven and earth. The intricate web of modern timekeeping, with its synchronized clocks, atomic precision, and global standards that allow billions of people across continents to operate in harmony, owes its very existence to the patient observations and sacred practices of our distant ancestors. For the centuries of staring skyward, tracking the waxing and waning of the moon, noting the rising of stars, and marking the passage of seasons were the foundation upon which every mechanical innovation would later rest, transforming the intangible flow of time into something measurable, predictable, and universally shared. What we now experience as the regimented tick of a second or the calculated turn of a calendar page was born from the same curiosity and necessity that compelled early humans to note that the full moon coincided with high tides, or that a certain constellation appeared only when it was time to plant barley. In essence, every atomic clock, every Greenwich Mean Time signal, and every coordinated leap second is an echo of a human gaze lifted to the sky, of minds striving to align mortal life with the vast, cyclical rhythm of the cosmos. Even the conceptual leap from lunar months to solar years, from informal timekeeping to structured calendars like the Julian and Gregorian systems, reflects a lineage of human ingenuity that sought to tame chaos and transform it into order, blending scientific observation with social, religious, and political necessity. Modern society, in its seemingly sterile precision, remains profoundly indebted to these early experiments in measuring the heavens. For without them, the coordination of agriculture, commerce, ritual, and governance on a scale that spans the globe would be inconceivable. In every meeting scheduled, every flight departure coordinated, every scientific experiment timed to the nanosecond, there is a hidden story of human persistence, imagination, and reverence for the patterns that govern our world, reminding us that even in our era of satellites, smart devices, and atomic clocks, you're still, in many ways, reading the same cosmic script our ancestors first traced on stone. In firelight, and with eyes turned toward the eternal dance of stars and moon, as the fog of Victorian London slowly lifts in our imagination, we can begin to piece together the extraordinary resilience and quiet heroism that define life in one of history's most challenging urban environments. The grimy streets, layered with soot, horse dung, and the remnants of industrial ambition, were more than just a backdrop. They were an ever-present adversary that tested every breath, every step, and every choice. Yet, within this suffocating haze of hardship, life persisted, stubborn and unyielding. Families crammed into single rooms found ways to nurture one another. Children navigated treacherous factories and docks with courage far beyond their years. And women, often underpaid and overworked, carried the dual burdens of labor and caregiving with astonishing fortitude. Their stories, though rarely celebrated in glossy history books, reflect the indomitable human spirit, the kind that finds laughter in overcrowded pubs, solace in small gestures of kindness, and pride in survival against odds that would seem insurmountable to us today. Even amidst disease, scarce medical care, and the omnipresent specter of poverty, the working-class communities of Victorian London exhibited a resilience that was both social and spiritual. A neighbor might lend a hand to repair a leaky roof. A mother might share her meager meal with a neighbor in greater need. And children learned to navigate the chaotic streets with a mix of cleverness and caution that allowed them to survive, if not thrive. In these small yet profound interactions, the heartbeat of the city pulsed, a rhythm of endurance, empathy, and human connection that belied the grime and chaos of everyday life. The pubs, noisy and crowded, became centers of laughter, song, and shared stories, proving that even in conditions of extreme deprivation, communities found ways to celebrate humanity and cling to hope. The lessons from Victorian London echo across time, reminding us that hardship does not strip away the capacity for courage, creativity, or compassion. These streets, which might have seemed relentlessly cruel, also fostered tenacity, ingenuity, and bonds of solidarity that continue to inspire. The narrative of survival in the face of adversity, whether in the cramped alleys of London or the broader sweep of human history, reveals that even in the darkest environments, people find ways to protect each other, to maintain dignity, and to leave an imprint of resilience for generations to come. When we look beyond London to Sparta, we encounter another form of human determination shaped by circumstance, culture, and expectation. Queen Gorgo, a figure of rare influence in a society dominated by war and strict codes of conduct, demonstrates how wisdom, strategy, and courage can flourish even in highly structured societies. Her life, intertwined with the fate of her husband Leonidas and the upbringing of her son Plerchus, reflects not only personal strength, but also a profound understanding of political and social dynamics, illustrating that leadership and empowerment often arise not from titles alone, but from insight, decisiveness, and an unwavering sense of responsibility. Her famous declaration, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men," encapsulates a philosophy of agency and empowerment that resonates far beyond Sparta. A reminder that influence and legacy are shaped as much by action and principle as by circumstance. In the harsh, remote deserts of the Umayyad Caliphate. Rulers turned practical necessity into artistry and political expression through the construction of desert castles like Qasr al-Mashhad and Qasr Amra. These structures, balancing utility with aesthetic grandeur, were carefully sited near water sources and trade routes, while adorned with frescoes, intricate stonework, and spaces designed for leisure and contemplation. They reveal a sophisticated synthesis of Eastern and Western cultural influences, reflecting authority, refinement, and the intellectual ambitions of an emerging civilization. Even when political upheaval left some castles incomplete, staring testaments to the blending of art, science, and power, showing that human ingenuity often seeks to impose beauty, order, and meaning even in the most inhospitable environments. Finally, the story of time itself, from early humans observing the cycles of the moon to the creation of modern mechanical and global systems, underscores the profound human desire to understand, measure, and harmonize with the world. Lunar cycles dictated agricultural schedules and festivals, and the gradual invention of months, weeks, and structured calendars reflected a growing need for precision in both governance and everyday life. Control over time became a form of authority, shaping societies, rituals, and even warfare. Today's exacting global timekeeping, though mechanical and standardized, owes its very existence to the careful, sacred, observant practices of our ancestors, who looked to the heavens for guidance, meaning, and order. The journey from celestial observation to atomic clocks is a testament to humanity's ingenuity and enduring fascination with the invisible yet inexorable flow of time, a reminder that every second we measure stands upon millennia of curiosity, adaptation, and insight. So as we close this journey through the streets of Victorian London, the courts of Sparta, the silent deserts of the Umayyads, and the vast continuum of time itself, remember the threads that connect us to those who came before: resilience, wisdom, creativity, and the unyielding drive to understand, survive, and leave a mark on the world. Tonight, let these stories accompany you into your dreams, a reminder that even in hardship, even in the far reaches of history, humanity persists, learns, and finds beauty in endurance. Sleep well, and may your night be filled with wonder and quiet reflection.